It's hard to believe, but it has been about 20 years since two words popped into the public eye. Blue zones. What were they? Well, what they were is just two words globbed together, and it is the ultimate way to describe the longest living cultures on the face of the earth. And now, 20 years later, we're looking back with a brand new book and a Netflix docuseries coming up, and I can't think of a better guest to welcome back to the exam room to tell us all about it than the face of the Blue Zone, my guy, Dan
Oh,
Buettner.
you're the best. Thank you very much.
How are
It's
you,
great to
Dan?
be back. I'm fantastic. I actually live the Blue Zones lifestyle. I feel terrific, and I'm it feels good to finally see Blue Zones kind of enter public consciousness, and like every overnight success, it's taken 20 years, but it was a worthwhile journey.
I bet. It is funny, 20 years, but in the span of our, human existence is not even a grain of sand, right? But so much has changed over the course of those 20 years as well. With this book, that's coming out here on August 29th. By the way, there's a link to pick up your copy right now in the show description and in the episode notes. There's a lot of phenomenal updates here. What have we learned over the course of 20 years in terms of longevity?
Probably most saliently that the average American could live about 14 extra years if they optimize their lifestyle. And by the way, that margin is growing. Life expectancy has dropped about 2.5 years in the last 3 years, and it continues to drop while the rest of the industrialized world grows. And the lessons that Blue Zones offer us can help us get most of those years back. It's very clear. Instead of, it's very vogue now to look for a biohack or look for some sort of an anti-aging nostrum to help us live longer, better lives. And none of those have been proven to add even a year of life expectancy. Whereas we know that the different characteristics of the Blue Zones, the different lessons they offer us, individually offer us up to 8 years each, and collectively offer us 14 extra years of life expectancy, as manifested by these people who are actually getting these years. So I'm very pleased to bring these to light in the Blue Zone Secrets to Living Longer and this new Netflix documentary.
Yeah, so let's nerd out a little bit when it comes to longevity here. Put on your nerd hat. Let's just dive right in. The water's fine. When you talk about studying longevity, you set out to do so by reverse engineering longevity. What do you mean by reverse engineering it?
So instead of looking for an answer in a petri dish or a test tube or some genetic code, we work with demographers. I work under the aegis of National Geographic, and we hired demographers, the population experts who were able to parse through worldwide census data, identify these hotspots where people have the best chance of reaching a healthy age 95, and in many cases over 100. And then once we've identified these 5 areas, then going there using established scientific methodology, parse out what these places are doing that explains the extraordinary longevity. And to make it very simple, we're looking for common denominators. No matter if you're in Asia, Europe, Latin America, the United States, what are these populations who have achieved the outcomes we want? What are they doing in common? And elucidating those are wherein lies, I believe, the true secret to longevity at the current state of the science.
Well, let's talk about these original 5 Blue Zones. And I'm going to say original 5 because update here, 20 years later, we now have a 6th Blue Zone. But let's talk about what's changed in the original 5 over the course of time. Let's go ahead and start with Sardinia in Italy. You got a chance to go back. How is the crew now in Sardinia? How are they living?
The good news is, for the most part, that blue zone has been preserved. We understand now that some of the things that are driving, when I first started this work, people were pretty sure it was genes, because Sardinia indeed has a very pure gene pool. It was a Bronze Age culture that moved into the highlands of Sardinia, beginning about 10,000 years ago. They originated in what is today the Basque Country. Very different culture than the rest of the Mediterranean, a matriarchal culture. And we were convinced it was genes, but we now realize that genes probably aren't driving. And one of the ways we know that is because um, the spouse of a centenarian is more likely to live longer than the sibling of a centenarian. So sibling has a lot more genetic overlap than a spouse does. So that really starts to point to a lifestyle, or perhaps, it could be microbiome. It could be a sharing of certain bacteria over time that achieves it. We don't know 100%, but we do see a very clear dietary pattern by looking at the villages and the geographical features of the villages. We see that in steep villages where the streets are steeply pitched, we see more higher life expectancy than we do on the flatter villages. So, it's these environmental or ecosystem factors that seem to be driving longevity more so than any behavioral change or genetic advantage.
By and large, one of the common themes throughout the Blue Zones is that sense of purpose. And all of the footage that you've brought back and you've put in your books and in your other series, and I'm sure what's going to be featured in the Netflix docuseries as well, is just how happy these individuals are. And so I'm wondering, like, is that sense of community in Italy as strong as it is, as you pointed out, in other areas of the Blue Zone as well? Are they still beaming ear to ear, happy to get up every day with that sense of purpose?
Well, there's a couple things. They do have I would say, a stronger societal bonds than we do. In order to survive, the highlands of Sardinia were uh, well, the founder population of Sardinia, which these people represent, they were all across Sardinia, and then the Phoenicians came, and the Romans came, and the Arabs came over time, and it always meant subjugation. When new people came, it meant slavery, it meant conquest, and this founder population retreated up into the highlands. Now the highest concentration of them are in just a cluster of 5 villages in the Nuoro and the Ogliastra provinces of Sardinia. And to survive, they had to cooperate. They had to cooperate not only as families, extended families, but also as communities. And you see that today. I mean, these people really stick together. There's not lonely people. Everybody knows each other. Everybody supports each other. And that's one of the facets that explains high life satisfaction. You can't really measure happiness. No, they don't wake up beaming ear to ear necessarily, but they are more satisfied with their lives than, say, Americans are. They're in the top 20 percentile of life satisfaction. And I think the happy coincidences you see very clearly, not only in Sardinia, but also Blue Zones, that the same things that help produce people are making it into their 90s and 100s, make the journey pleasurable. Sense of purpose, strong community, sense of community, a strong sense of family, healthy food. Uh, these are things that make life fun, and it's not an injection or some longevity hack. Some Silicon Valley billionaire spending millions of dollars doing. It's uh, the practices that we've evolved with over centuries that we know resonate with the human psyche, and they make life pleasurable.
And based off of your findings, I mean, and I'm sure that you've been asked this question to death, but I think it's still an important one to raise time and again because by and large, I think that the majority of us haven't really contemplated this. How does the importance of having that sense of purpose, that strong bond in the community, compare to what we think of as traditional health in terms of eating well, getting the right medication, even the right amount of sleep, that kind of stuff? How do the two compare? Can you even quantify?
Well, Robert Butler, who was the founding director of the National Institutes on Aging, was the chief author of a study that looked at the retrospective writings of people over time. And he found that people who could articulate their sense of purpose live about 8 years longer than people who are rudderless in life. And not coincidentally, I believe that in blue zones, there's vocabulary for purpose. It manifests in different ways. In Okinawa, it's ikigai. In the Nicoya Peninsula of Costa Rica, it's plan de vida. In Sardinia, I would say it's their religion and their fidelity to their community. People wake up defending their community and practicing their faith. That's how purpose manifests itself. And 8 years, think about that. I challenge you or anybody to tell me about one drug or one supplement that promises even 1 year of extra life expectancy, whereas knowing your sense of purpose is worth 8. And that translates. Purpose is kind of a vague thing for a lot of people. But what it really means, and where we translate this wisdom into everyday life, it's about knowing your values. It's about knowing what you're good at, what you like to do, and an outlet that serves others. This is very common in all blue zones. And if you want to find that in America, purpose doesn't necessarily come with our culture. It takes that individual inventory to understand what your gifts are and to make sure you're putting them to work either in your profession. That's a minority of people. About 30% of Americans actually find purpose at work. But for most of us, it has to be in our community, some volunteer opportunity, or it can be just with our family.
Do you consider your work with the Blue Zones to be your purpose? Because it doesn't take a big leap to say, man, this guy is really helping out a lot of people. That's got to give you a certain amount of drive to get up every morning.
Yeah, I'm an explorer. I'm not a health guru, and I generally think people who say I'm here to, change the health of America. They're usually trying to sell you something. My background is in journalism, and it's in exploration. I've been with National Geographic for over 20 years, and before that, I biked across continents, and I had a company that solved ancient mysteries. So I really come to this as an investigator more so than an evangelist. But I do believe, and getting to your question of purpose, yes, I would say if I had to distill my purpose, or what the reason I wake up in the morning, it's to um, travel the world, finding and exploring the traditional peoples, and then distilling out the lessons they offer us to live better. And sometimes it's happiness, and for blue zones, it's longevity. And that is my personal purpose. It's a
I,
great job.
Oh, I would think so. I would think that as well as you've covered this, and the fact that you're still doing it after so many years and are an explorer at heart, I would think it's hard to envision you doing much of anything else that could bring you this sense of professional purpose. And you get to go out and see the world. You still get to explore, man. I mean, like that's a pretty righteous job you got, Dan.
Yeah, it's on expense account too. No, and I continue to do it. And I thought my cover story for National Geographic appeared in 2005, which is 18 years ago. My first book came out 3 years later. And I thought I'd be done. And since then, I've written 4 books. Just the latest is The Secrets of Long Life, all about the ever evolving story and insight that come from Blue Zone. This is not a static investigation, but where I guess I've gotten the most sort of job satisfaction, I've been able to translate the insight from the Blue Zone and apply it to cities. If you Google Blue Zones projects, we've been to over 72 cities in America. We are hired by insurance companies, and we only go into cities where we have the support of the public sector, the mayor, city council, etc. And we've been very successful at applying wisdom from places like Sardinia in American cities and lowering the BMI and thereby lowering healthcare costs. And in a country where healthcare costs continue to skyrocket, we're now past the $4 trillion mark. Obesity and diabetes continue to be on the rise. We have found something that's bent the curve, and this comes directly from these traditional people that I managed to identify around the world in these so-called blue zones.
You know what? Let me ask you this before we move on to the next blue zone. I mean, is it how does one begin to make change in their own community, especially in these bigger urban communities, right? I'm not far from Washington, D.C., but we could just as easily be talking about L.A. or New York, where it's just this massive city. I mean, how can somebody affect change with the blue zones in those bigger, larger areas that are so densely populated?
Well, the first thing to realize is doing nothing is going to cost a lot more than doing something. Secondly, it's very hard for an individual unless the individual is very well wired and can pull people together. In fact, in each one of our Blue Zones project cities, it's usually boiled down to one person who said, we're going to make a change around here. And they're able to pull together the public sector and the private sector around Blue Zones. But the big idea here and the central premise of Blue Zones is if you want to uh, live longer and get healthier, trying to change your behavior, which is we're marketed to relentlessly. New diet, new exercise program, new superfood. None of those work. I defy anybody to find a behavioral modification program that has actually worked in the United States for any amount of time beyond a year. What does work is reshaping our ecosystem, our environment. So when we go into cities, we work with city council to help them find consensus around policies that make healthy food, which this case is whole plant-based food, cheaper and more accessible over the junk food, to make the favor the pedestrian over the motorist, so walking and cleaner air ensue, to make smoking more difficult and non-smoking more celebrated. We certify restaurants, grocery stores, workplaces, and schools when they make policy changes and they change their designs to unconsciously nudge people into moving more, eating better, socializing more, and knowing their sense of purpose and living out their sense of purpose. So, how does an individual do that? That's tough. You can come to the Blue Zones website and click on Blue Zones projects and see if you see the process necessary. It's not impossible. Like I said, 72 American cities, including Fort Worth, Texas, Naples, Florida. We're now starting in Phoenix, Arizona, and Jacksonville, Florida. These are all cities who, bound together, private sector and public sector, said we're going to change the environment to set people up for success. And you know what? It works.
That is fantastic. I mean, you get a Texas city in there. You got, I mean, none of the cities you mentioned there are particularly small. I mean, those are some pretty substantial cities here in the U.S. I think that that's fantastic. I definitely want to keep tabs on that. I know that there are a lot of exam roomies who live near there, or if not within the city boundaries themselves, who just heard that and they're like, "Ooh, I got to get on board with that project." So we're going to keep tabs on that. But let's shift south here. Let's go to Costa Rica here and Nicoya, one of the original five as well. What has changed in Nicoya over the last couple of decades, Dan?
Well, we have a little bit better data. We can see that a centenarian over time there, or male, has about an eightfold better chance of reaching 100 than in the United States, for example. That we have a 2.5-fold, or people in Nicoya have a 2.5 better chance of reaching a healthy age 95 in general. And what's extraordinary about that is they spend 1/15 the amount we do on healthcare. So this notion that you have to be rich or you have to spend lots of money on expensive drugs and fancy hospitals, it's just not it. The clear lesson that emerges is universal health care and good public health is a far better investment at producing a healthy population than curing cancer or our pursuit of curing cancer, which isn't working very well, or curing heart disease once it takes hold, or curing type 2 diabetes once it takes hold. In Costa Rica, they have this very ingenious system called Eat ATOP, which is basically basic health teams that go in every neighborhood, visit every home once a year. They show up with your records. They look in your backyard for signs of infectious disease, standing water, etc., that breed mosquitoes that that spread malaria and cholera and so forth. Go in your refrigerator and look at what you've been eating to identify sources of chronic disease, the sugar sweetened beverages and the processed meats we know are driving disease in this country. And they help make a change before it shows up in the emergency room 15 years later. It's a very clear message that our policymakers aren't getting yet. We hope we eventually do. I'm working a little bit with Congressman Dean Phillips on a bill that might start paying attention to these things. But those are very clear lessons.
Absolutely. And I think that's something that we absolutely want to keep our eye on as well. I don't want to take too much of your time. I know that you've got this whirlwind here, so maybe, another 10 minutes or so. But couple more blue zones here, man, before we talk about the new one. Loma Linda, so we were talking about the U.S. there, obviously. I loved the segment where I think the woman's name was Marge, and she was still out there driving at a ripe old age, and she's barreling down the highway. And that really encapsulated what Loma Linda was. How are things in Loma Linda today? Is it still this long living community, or, how are the people?
Yeah, Adventists are still living longer than their American counterparts. They're doing it largely, I think, because they take their diet directly from the Bible. Genesis, um, pretty clearly, God um, prescribes the diet for the humans as every tree that bears fruit, every plant that bears seed, and green plants. And the Adventists are more likely to adhere to that plant-based diet than other religions, and I believe that explains a lot of it. They have a Saturday Sabbath, which separates them a little bit from mainstream community, but better enables them to stick to this plant-based diet to support each other. We know that people who belong to religion and show up, they tend to live longer than people who don't have religion. We don't exactly know why, but it seems to work. And they're doing a great job. I wish Loma Linda would pay more attention to its built environment. They've let traffic run amok there, but they have a very good university that is probably one of the top plant-based institutions, hospital systems in America. The Adventist health system is a phenomenal health system that really brings their values to their care, and they produce results.
And what about our good friends over in Greece, in Ikaria? How are they today, Dan?
Yes, Roman Legrand, a colleague there, has done a survey of people 90 years old, and very recently, people over 90, and found some interesting things. I know there's a lot of negative press coming out about alcohol consumption, but it's pretty clear that there people are drinking every day. Over 80% of people 90 drank most days of their life, moderately red wine, and they're still sharp and vital. So it's pretty clear from that example that moderate drinking's okay, or it doesn't. It's not mutually exclusive with living a long, healthy life. But also, you see very clearly that the longest lived people are taking naps. The high consumption of olive oil, I know that goes against some dogma within the plant-based community, now oil, but the number one predictor of low mortality after age 65 is olive oil consumption there. There are a variety of herbs, especially rosemary is emerging as kind of, for lack of a better term, a longevity herb when it comes to lowering inflammation and antioxidants and perhaps a mild diuretic. So this is a very rich place to mine insights. And what I found most extraordinary about Ikaria is the young people are embracing the culture of their grandparents and preserving it more actively than in any other of the other blue zones. They understand the treasure, which is their uh, traditional culture, their traditional way of eating and connecting in festivals. And instead of letting the standard American diet come in and destroy their way of eating, and sort of an American way of living come in and replace what's worked for them for at least 2,000 years, they're preserving it, and I applaud them for that.
And that's an unfortunately brilliant segue to the last of the original Blue Zones, which is Okinawa, which you actually refer to in The Secrets for Living Longer as a fading blue zone. So clearly not the update there that people were hoping for. You write about this influx, the influence of the standard American diet really taking over there, and it's just wreaking havoc. As a matter of fact, you write that you fear with this elderly generation, when they fade away, so too will the blue zones altogether for that region. That's not the update we were really hoping for,
No, it's
unfortunately.
not the one. By the way, I've been going there since 1999. And when I was there in 1990, it was producing the longest lived, healthiest population on the planet. And now it's among, if not the least healthy prefecture in Japan, 47 prefectures. And the only explanation I can offer is, since I've been going there, an absolute forest of junk food restaurants has grown up around the American food base and proliferated throughout the island. The McDonald's, the KFCs, the A&Ws. It's just it's heartbreaking to see this beautiful food tradition completely paved over by the crap that's driving so much chronic disease in the United States. And at the same time, among the centenarians, almost none of them owned cars. Traditionally, they walked. They lived in villages. They walked over to see their neighbor. And now increasingly, you see that island crisscross with major freeways, and the car is the predominant form of transportation now there. And as people get off their feet and behind the steering wheel, their obesity rises, their type 2 diabetes rises, inactivity sets in. They're making all the same mistakes that we're making in the United States. And the tragedy of that is, at the same time, a generation earlier, it offered a format, a blueprint that clearly delivered health and longevity and centenarians. And instead of embracing that and preserving it, they're throwing it out in the garbage in favor of the sparkly things that our culture offers.
And I wonder if you write about this a little bit in the book. Does this lack of adoption have more to do with the fact that the younger generation there is not adopting the ways of their elders, or is it the fact that there's such a large military contingent from the United States that also happens to populate Okinawa? Which do you think is really kind of driving this in the wrong direction?
Well, all I can tell you is that we have a huge base there, and the Americans there have a much bigger taste for fast foods, and they want the foods that they're familiar with back home, not necessarily in the Okinawan sweet potatoes and tofu. So it's introduced, and by the way, those foods are engineered to be absolutely intoxicating. Bliss Point, uh, French fries and hamburgers and spam. They're full of fat and salt, and we're evolutionarily hardwired to crave those foods. And once you develop a taste for it, it's very hard to go back to the relatively bland um, Goya champuru, their stir fry, or delicious artesian tofu, or sweet potatoes, which have driven their health and longevity traditionally. So it's tempting to point a finger and say, there's a villain here. There's not really a villain. Villain perhaps is Americans, uh, corporations' imperative to drive shareholder value, and the health of people be damned. But it's just enterprise and quote unquote progress, and until we realize that it's not really what we want, and governments start changing policy, and a business responds by creating healthier choices, meaningfully healthy choices, not just labeled healthy choices. Uh, we're going to see the sickness that America invented increasingly exported to places that have traditionally been healthy.
But here is the good news. Let's cheer up the conversation a little bit more. Whereas we have one blue zone that's fading, we now have a sixth blue zone, which is very exciting. You write about this in the book. And when you said that it was Singapore, I was kind of like, wow, I was not expecting that. So what is happening in Singapore that the rest of the world, save five other places, really isn't tapped into yet?
Yeah, when I first proposed Singapore as a model, my editor at National Geographic killed the story, and 5 years later, they came back and made it a cover story. So I've been studying Singapore for about 15 years now. I met and interviewed the minister there, Lee Kuan Yew, who's he and his ministers are largely responsible for arguably the most successful experiment in building an economy and manufacturing a blue zone or a healthy place in the world. In 1965, it had a life expectancy of about 25 years less than it has today. And now it is producing the longest lived healthy people in the world. Whether near the top or on the top, it depends what list you look at, but significantly 10 good years longer than Americans are living. And it's not a mistake, and it's not some ancient culture. This is a melting pot of Indians, Malay, and Chinese people thrown into this melting pot. But uh, Lee Kuan Yew and his government has shown that you can, if you have the courage to stand up to business interests and lobbyists, you can curb junk food. In Singapore, their soda pop has about 20% less sugar than the same soda in the United Kingdom. They subsidize healthy brown rice, and you can pay full price for white rice. They saw very early the health consequences of letting traffic run amok, as we have in America. We spend way too much time in our cars. Singapore, you're going to spend 2 to 3 times more for your automobile, largely because of taxes. But that tax money, is then spent on a very efficient, fast, and safe subway system, public transportation. Nobody's more than a couple hundred feet, a couple hundred yards from a stop. There are covered walkways. 40% of Singapore is covered in green spaces, so it's cooler and it's aesthetically pleasing. So that draws people to want to walk. It's a very safe place to be. And some of the more overlooked characteristics that drive low life expectancy, uh, drug use, the opioid epidemic, and the 100,000 or so Americans that die every year from drug overdoses are driving down life expectancy perhaps as much as a year. In Singapore, there are very severe repercussions from dealing in opiates. You can be put to death if you're a drug dealer. You put in prison for just 15 grams of opiates. Government is closely regulating drugs. It's very hard to get fentanyl, for example, and very hard on drugs is producing a great outcome. Only about 18 people have died from illegal overdoses last year in Singapore. Same thing with guns. I know guns is a very controversial subject in America. We believe we should have the right to own guns and handguns and assault rifles, etc. But we have over 55,000 Americans die every year in violent gun deaths or accidents. Meanwhile, Singapore, they decided that individuals should not own guns at all, and as a result, they only about 3 people have died in gun deaths. And so you ask yourself, what's a safer society? Well, if you look at the hard statistics, Singapore is clearly safer when it comes to gun violence and gun death. And America should be paying attention to what's working in a place that manifestly produces healthy longevity, and taking some lessons instead of continuing to do the same things over and over.
It's fascinating, and I'm listening to you, and I'm hanging on every word, and I'm thinking like this is definitely a nutrition show, but what you're really eloquently pointing out here is it's not one thing, right? It's not the red wine, it's not the olive oil, it's not just diet. It's the sense of purpose, it's the laws, it's the lifestyle, it's all of this that rolls into one, and that is what creates the blue zone. So when you're creating this and you're trying to explain it to somebody, and I feel like a lot of times we have this kind of reductionist mentality where it always has to be that one thing. There's always that one answer, and once you're able to crack that one answer, then suddenly everything falls into place. But we're talking about a really, in a lot of cases, these communities are built quite simplistically, but nonetheless, longevity is a very complex issue. So, I mean, it's not just one thing. It's a million little things, to borrow that phrase. Am I right in assuming that?
I think interventions are, I think of it as silver buckshot as opposed to silver bullet, but you can reduce it somewhat. First of all, what yields a healthier population is mostly eating whole food, plant based. It's moving naturally. It's moving all day long as opposed to exercise. That means walking to work and school and having gardens and not having machines do all of our work. It's having strong social connections, uh, a circle of good friends, and an environment where it's easy to bump into people. And fourth, it's knowing your sense of purpose and living that purpose and not waking up existentially stressed every day. The way to deliver it, and this is where it gets simpler, is that instead of spending time, money, and resources on trying to change our behavior, as we do in America, it's instead of trying to constantly pursue health, which is almost always a long term failure. The real secret is shifting the focus to changing our environment so that the healthy choice is the easy choice, so that it facilitates people eating a plant based diet, moving more, socializing more. And that it's largely has to do with um, our cities and our counties and our states prioritizing the pedestrian over the driver, curbing junk food marketing, and junk food prevalence, and taking the subsidies from junk food and moving it over to healthy food, and then making it easier for people to connect face to face as opposed to electronically or implode into our homes. People are a lot more social in connected neighborhoods than they are in suburbs, and municipal governments have lots of levers to pull on creating healthy neighborhoods or creating sprawling suburbs. So there's a lot we can do. For the most part, we're aiming at the wrong target, I believe, in America. But these blue zones offer the right target, and they offer a very cohesive and cogent way to hit those targets and produce healthier populations.
Two more for you. First, which of these cultures do you most identify with? Is it the Okinawan culture? Is it Greece? Is it Loma Linda? Which one really speaks most to Dan Buettner?
I have a wonderful group of friends, almost like family in Ikaria, that I almost feel that's my second home. And I also resonate a lot with the Costa Ricans in the Nicoya Peninsula. Those two, by the way, are probably the easiest to visit and see the Blue Zone. And yeah, and that's very personal, by the way. It's not at all objective.
That's why I wanted to ask. I wanted the Dan Buettner opinion, my friend. And then the final one, because this is such a food show, and even though we did just talk about reduction a little bit, let's talk about the Blue Zones food guidelines. So if somebody wants to start, and their first step, and if they're listening to this show, it's probably going to be the first step, is to change their diet. What are some of the foods that you have found in your research that really have hinted toward getting started toward that healthier, longer life?
Yeah, I know the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine are very evidence-based, and they arrived at a certain way of eating. I arrived at slightly different. If you want to know what a centenarian ate to live to be 100, you have to know what they were eating throughout their lives as children, young adults, retirees, and now. And you can't just ask them because they don't remember. So we got at that by aggregating dietary surveys done in all 5 blue zones over the past 90 years. They go back to 1930 or so. And when you do a meta-analysis, what emerges very clearly in all 5 blue zones, they're eating 90 to 100% whole food plant-based. Now, that's changing. So if you go to Sardinia today, you're not going to see it because of this, thanks to the American food culture crashing on their shores in the last decade or so. But the 5 pillars of every longevity diet are whole grains, greens, tubers like sweet potatoes, nuts, and beans. Every Blue Zone culture is eating about a cup of beans a day, which is probably associated with an extra 4 years of life expectancy. Of course, they're eating their seasonal fruits and vegetables on top of that. But the big lesson to Americans are none of these foods are expensive. You can eat a very healthy diet by shopping on the lower shelves in your grocery store, the beans and the grains, and it's easy to gussy them up and taste good. They have eaten some meat. I know that's an inconvenient finding, but a tenth the amount of meat that Americans eat, or 20th even. No cow's dairy of any significance, traditionally speaking, and a lot less fish than you would think as well. The clear guidelines, for populations in the Blue Zones brand, we promote a whole food plant-based diet. If you're eating in the Blue Zones, that's what you're eating. We know people want to treat themselves once in a while with some other foods that are less healthy, and we don't chastise them and we don't judge them. But for the most part, we're big believers that we solve a lot of problems by mostly eating a whole food plant-based diet.
Love it, man. That's a great way to end it. And I'll just add to it that you also write in the book about, we turn to supplements so much for our nutrition, and yet there's no evidence to back up the fact that a supplement is going to help extend your life. In fact, you point out it can even lead to a shorter life, and yet we spend billions and billions of dollars every single year on these, whereas we could simplify it, turn to the kitchen, start living that Blue Zone lifestyle, and do ourselves a world of good. Man, congratulations on the release of the book, The Blue Zones, Secrets for Living Longer, August 29th. There's a link to pick up your copy right now in the show description or in the episode notes. Of course, you can also visit your local book retailer and then hop on Netflix August 30th. Live to 100, Secrets of the Blue Zone, 4-part docuseries. Man, the Blue Zones are on the rise, and thank you for all of your time, your effort, your energy, your years of research, and you're just continuing to do such good in the world. And a man that can talk fashion. Dan, you are the man.
Well, we first met and bonded over your shoes. So, I've always aspired to your level of footwear. I wear sneakers and, you wear cool shoes. Eventually I'll get there.
Anytime you want to go shoe shopping, I'm more than happy to take you, my friend. My treat.
A bromance is born.
And so it is. Dan Buettner, thank you, my friend.
All right, Chuck. Good talking to you. And thank you very much. And you guys, I love you. I support you. Keep doing your good work.
If your health IQ is a couple of points higher than it was a few minutes ago, go ahead and like this video or subscribe to the YouTube channel. And to take it even higher, head over to Apple Podcast or wherever you get your favorite shows. Look for The Exam Room by the Physicians Committee. Hit the subscribe button there as well and help to make your world a healthier place.